as the mother of all circuses. We had over 100 circuses that started here in Wisconsin. So I think that's just incredible to think years ago in the late 1800s and the early 1900s that we actually sponsored the opening of 100 circuses. So my Grahn relatives would talk about how poor they were. They had no money, poor farmers. Dad owned a store that the mom was running, and she dies. It's the Depression. They would watch the circus trains go by because Westfield is not far from Baraboo. Or they would go to Baraboo and they'd see circus things. For them, that was something very exotic, very different from the existence they lived. So it doesn't surprise me that they thought the circus was just a great thing. You know, we grew up in a rural area, not much happens. The circus comes to town, it's pretty tempting to think it's going to be all rainbows, you know, to go to the circus. So here we had over 100 circuses in Wisconsin, 26 wintered in Delavan. The Ringling Brother Barnum and Bailey Circus started in Baraboo, and then their cousins, the Golmers, had a circus, and several circuses through the cousins. In fact, when I was researching my aunt, I found out that Judge Goldman used to come to Montello, to the courthouse there, and hear trials. And somebody told him, they knew that his family was in the circus and related to the Ringlings, that my aunt had retired there, and would he like any of her dresses for the museum down in Baraboo, so they gave them to him. And so when I was researching him, his name kept coming up over and over and over, and I thought, why? Well, I guess it was in Plainfield, what's the guy that dug up all the dead bodies? Ed Gein. Right. He was the judge that put Ed Gein in prison and kept him in a insane asylum until he died. So besides being related to the circus, he and having to do with the founding of the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, he also had that distinction. So anyway, so that really is sort of cool that the people from Wisconsin have that legacy. So as I was doing now and then in Ripon for the Ripon Commonwealth Press, which is a weekly column, I came across the former mayor, John Wilson. So I just added this in here because I'm wondering if anybody from Princeton was in the circus or any of these other small burgs. So John Wilson, he graduated from Ripon High School and he attended Fond du Lac Commercial College, and then he became a trapeze flyer. Now how that happened, I literally have no idea.
Yeah.
So he ran away to the circus and he performed in the circus. Then he became friends with Maud Golmer, who was related to the Ringlings, and they started their own circus in 1933. He invested all the money he made in the circus as a trapeze artist, but it was the Great Depression, and I guess a show that had a wrestling alligator went to all the places they were going to and came first, and everybody spent their money on seeing the wrestling alligator and couldn't afford to see the circus. So their circus failed. So he basically moved back to Ripon. He served in World War II. He worked at Speed Queen, which is now Alliance Laundry Systems. He became Ripon's mayor. His grandfather was also the mayor of Ripon. And he was the member of the Circus Fans Association and the chairperson. So he was always involved in the circus in some way. So in 1969, he was asked to come to Baraboo and help them run the Circus World Museum. So that's the second time he ran away to the circus.
Yeah. Cute.
So once in his youth and once after retirement. So I think that's funny that there are people in our history in these small communities that basically did run away to the circus, came back, lived normal lives, and you'd have no idea that that was a part of their heritage. So that's just somebody else from our region that was in the circus. And this is a picture of Mr. Wilson in Baraboo with one of the clowns in Baraboo, well, after he retired. So he was in his 60s when this picture was taken. Okay, so my aunt retired. Her health wasn't that good. You're 600 pounds. There's just issues. So at first she moved home to Lake Lawrence near Westfield, and then she moved back to Montello. So they built a concrete pad, they put a trailer on it, and they moved to Montello. And the interesting thing is we kept finding newspaper articles about my aunt, and now that we can word search newspaper articles, I have to go back and word search and see if I can find more. These are just some that my family has saved. So if anybody doesn't know, through the Winnifox Library System, we can now word search all the local papers, which makes research really great. So this man here worked for the Social Security office. My aunt was 61 years old. He came back, and she was one of the first people that got early Social Security. So they wrote an article about this because it was very unusual at that time for somebody to take Social Security so early. Funny thing is my dad was reading the paper in like 1973 or 4, and this man had retired, and they asked him about his career, and he said, the one thing I remember is going to get the fat lady from the circus enrolled in Social Security. So she was one of the first people to get Social Security. So she basically received $509 a month, and then she had her circus savings. So.
Wow.
So why she moved back to Montello, they asked her to be in a show at the high school. So somebody was kind enough to give me this program, and it's really sort of cool to see all the different businesses that existed at that time and the people that were involved with that. And it actually has my aunt on here, Ella Milbauer here. She was in the circle and other places because she loved to sing. So she actually was in this production over in Montello, and that was 1962 in January. So her health was failing about that time, and she did have cancer. It was very difficult for everybody with her having cancer because at that time they did not accommodate people of that size. So she had to have hospital beds lashed together, and there just weren't services for people that large. So it was a little bit difficult on everybody taking care of her. But this is how I remember my Aunt Ella. This is a visit, one of her visits to I lived kitty corner for my aunt, so it was either at my aunt's house or my house. This is Aunt Ella when she came to visit. So this picture, I believe, was taken in front of my aunt's house. But I lived literally across the street. So here's Aunt Ella and Uncle Bob as they came for family dinner. Oh, where'd you go? Okay, so this is me. Here's my Aunt Ella, okay? This is my dad, my adoptive father, and this is at my house. So I remember a lot of this, and it is sort of fun when you have an aunt that's a fat lady in the circus because, God, your memories. She could not fit on a chair, so my dad would take a leaf off of a strong oak table, he always told me, and he laid it between two chairs. And she sat on two chairs at the end of the table because no one could get around her once she sat down.
Sure.
So they sat her out of the way at every event because you just couldn't get around her. She wasn't that mobile. Now, that's my Aunt Martha, her sister, her brother, her husband. Here I am. I think that's this is my brother Ron, my adopted brother Ron. So they would come for family dinners at our house when I was a kid because she was no longer welcome at my Uncle Art and Auntie's house because she had come and broken the furniture so many times and had other incidents that she wasn't welcome there. And my cousin, who's 15 years older than I am, Bonnie, she doesn't even want to tell anybody she has an aunt that was a fat lady in the circus because she's totally embarrassed. Well, my kids grew up the same way. We went to Appleton on a field trip with my daughter. She was about 4th or 5th grade, and we went to the Houdini exhibit at the castle next to Lawrence University on College Avenue in Appleton. And I'd never been to it before, and I walked up, and literally there was a picture of my aunt this size. And I said, "Look at Heidi, it's Aunt Ella." Well, of course, Heidi was totally embarrassed that she would have an aunt that was a fat lady in the circus. So, that was very embarrassing to my cousin because her friends would come over and see my aunt. And I guess she didn't like to sleep in clothes, and she'd sleep in the nude on this day bed. So when they came to knock on the door, they'd see my aunt there. So my cousin was very embarrassed. My kids are the same way.
Yeah.
So
That's crazy.
this is me,
Oh.
right here. Here's my Aunt Ella over here. So yeah, my Uncle Art, that's her brother. So anyway, yeah, they always put her somewhere out of the way. So our kitchen was sort of odd in our house, so my mother would put my aunt sort of against a wall on the other side of the table because she'd just get in the way, and my mother would turn her back towards her while she was washing the dishes, you know. And so they'd visit, and she said, Adeline, that pie was so good, can I have another piece of pie? And my mom would say, yeah, Ella, just help yourself. And my mom turned around and the whole pie was gone. So I am used to hearing stories like that from my family. So you cannot have an aunt that's a fat lady in the circus and not have funny stories. Yeah. So my nephew Kyle is 46 years old, and when he was in first grade, the first grade teacher called up his mother and said, Mrs. Grahn, we need to have a parent-teacher conference. And so my sister-in-law took off of work and she came to talk to the teacher, and she said, well, what's going on? And the teacher said, well, Kyle is telling some pretty outlandish stories that I know cannot be true, and we need to work together as parent and teacher to help him through this. And she said, well, what kind of stories is he telling? And the teacher said, well, he says his aunt was a fat lady in the circus. Well, yeah, his great aunt was a fat lady in the circus. And me being the keeper of all the pictures, I had to mail a picture so he could take it in for show and tell. So, you know, there's all those funny stories that come up. And literally, people never believed me my aunt was a fat lady in the circus. It's just like such an oddball thing, but yeah, Aunt Ella was. Let's see here. So, my favorite stories about my aunt are when she died. And this is an article several years after she died about how they made her casket. It was made in Sheboygan at a custom casket company. So this is just part of a newspaper article that came out, you know, in 1979, and she died in 1964 in this custom casket company. This is one of the things they really remembered. So my aunt died in her travel trailer, and now you have 600 pounds of quote-unquote dead weight. Oh. So what are you going to do? How are you going to get her out of there? So they called up the entire volunteer fire department in Montello. So the volunteer, and I talked to their former fire chief, who was still alive. He was well into his 90s when I talked to him. He goes, yeah, we got all the guys out there, and we sort of rolled her onto a tarp and dragged her out. And then they said, we didn't know if the weight of the hearse would take her, or if we could get her up there, so we had a flatbed truck there, you know, like somebody's pickup truck, and I can't remember if we took her down to the funeral home in a pickup truck or the hearse. So they got her down to the funeral home, and at that time, if you go through Montello, you know how the main cemetery is right on the highway there. Then there was one house, and the house next to that used to be the funeral home. So the funeral home was just literally right next to the cemetery. So they got my aunt into the funeral home, but in those days they did not have caskets for people that large. Today they do. Back then they didn't. So they had to order a custom casket. It was quartered and made larger, and they sent the casket in. So of course when it came in the door, they could take the casket and they could turn it sideways in the door. Now they have a fat lady in a casket, and they can't get it out of the funeral home. So they had, and I remember this very vividly, they had a handyman take the picture window out of the funeral home, and her casket was put through the picture window. Now they had, I think, 10 pallbearers, and so I think there's 6 normally, and my cousin was one of the youngest, and he said when they picked up that casket, his knees just buckled. And so they thought that the funeral home director would just put the casket on like a little wheel dolly, and they just wheel it down to the cemetery because they were so close. Literally, my aunt was so large that she could not fit in the Grahn family plot. And if you go through Montello, you're going to see a silver urn that says Grahn. You can see that's the old Grahn, the new Grahn plot. The old one is up on the hill, but it didn't have enough places to bury her and my uncle because she needed 2 burial plots. And there were only 2 left, so that meant my Uncle Bob couldn't be married with Ella. So they got a newer plot further to the west. So now they're maybe a quarter of a block from the funeral home. But they did not think that the dolly wheel would take the weight of her in the casket. Now this I do not remember. I guess they did not know if the hearse would take the weight of her in the casket. So they had a flatbed tow truck standing by in case they needed it to take her the quarter of a mile down to, or the quarter of a block down to where she was buried. Then, I don't remember this either, but my cousins are 15 and 20 years older than me, and they said they laughed through the whole funeral because you know how you put a casket onto these straps, and then afterwards they lower the, the casket down? Well, my cousins also said, we just sat there and laughed. We wanted the preacher to pray faster because that whole thing was going,
Oh, boy.
so they thought the whole casket was just going to collapse into the bottom. Yeah, right. So anyway, I don't remember that, but I certainly remember the funeral. I certainly remember the casket going through the front window. I remember standing at the graveside. I don't remember the creaking.
Unbelievable.
So that is my favorite story about my aunt, is her death, because how much better of a story could you make up?
Right, that's great.
So later on, I found the person that bought the trailer that she occupied, and that trailer is still there. It's been covered up. It looks more like a house than a trailer now. It's sort of had like walls and siding put on it, but it's still there. And so it was a lady from Racine. I'm still in contact with her, Cynthia. And Cynthia's mother had died. She was just with her dad. He was a school teacher. They had summers off. They bought Aunt Ella's trailer, and they would come up to Montello and fish and just hang out for the summer because her dad didn't have to work in the summer. So she didn't really know at first about Aunt Ella, and they would hear singing in the living room, somebody singing, "Let Me Call You Sweetheart." And so later, talking to the neighbor said, "Oh, that's the fat lady singing." So the neighbors told some pretty interesting stories, like she was too big to fit into the bathtub in the trailer, so she sort of had a cattle trough outside, and in the summer she'd take baths outside. But anyway, that "Let Me Call You Sweetheart" makes total sense to my aunt, because my Aunt Martha and my Aunt Ella would sing that all the time. So this is one of the quotes from my book. When you are larger than life here on earth, perhaps it's hard to get into the hereafter, and maybe the pearly gates just aren't wide enough. So I think maybe she's still in Montello singing "Let Me Call You Sweetheart." So that's the, I don't know, abbreviated version of Aunt Ella. I have a few more stories, but does anybody have any questions about my aunt or what she did?
Did you meet any of her sideshow performers after the fact? Or?
Never met any of the side. I did talk to quite a few sideshow people. It's a unique bunch. And just to let you know, I do not like circus history. That is not an area of history that I like. And I did write a book about it you can check out. That was the first attempt I ever had at a historical book, and I had young kids, so it's sort of small. Eventually I want to expand that and write another one. I've written other historical books since, but you can check that out here at the library. It's out of print. You can't find one. Somebody said today one online is $60.
Yes.
But you can find them at the used book sale in Green Lake and Ripon. I find them periodically and buy them and bring them home, so I have extra copies. But the library has 3 copies. You can check one out. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for having
Does anyone
me.
remember,
Does anybody remember
Ella
Ella?
from town? I think, Mary, didn't you mention that you remembered her from your store?
Yes, we had a store, and part of it we had a shoe department, and in the shoe department we had a large wooden bench, and when she'd come to town, she'd come and sit in there and rest for a while, so, you know.
Yeah, she was, needed to rest carrying around 600 pounds, I would think. Surprised the bench didn't break. We heard a lot of stories of breaking furniture.
Wow.
Yeah, she's quite remembered in this area. So it is funny, because I'm 67, so the people that remember her are older than I am. But there are still people that remember Aunt Ella in this area.
And there were children?
No children. In that family, there were 7 siblings. My Uncle Art had 2 girls. No one else had any other children. My parents adopted my brother and I, and we were 15 and 20 years younger than our cousins. And so when my aunt and uncle died, they left my brother and I money because they thought education was very important. So I did inherit about $2,000 from my aunt in 1964. I actually used that money to buy a new car. So, and my cousin always held that against me. She never inherited any money from Aunt Ella, but she'd been getting money since she was 20 years older. She'd been getting money all all those years, and I was that much younger, so. Yeah, that was always a bone of contention in my family that my brother and I inherited and my other two cousins didn't. Yeah. But
Thank you.
whatever, thank you.
Yeah,
Wonderful, wonderful.